mighty course of robbery!
This episode of Guns, Gold, and Bitcoin is brought to you by your friendly, extra-national, unelected cartel of private bankers, the Federal Reserve. As in, we reserve the right to artificially trigger inflation by printing money out of thin air, so that while you exchange your scarce, priceless, and irreplaceable sacred gift of time on this earth for some hard-earned frog skins, we reserve the right to continuously degrade the value and purchasing power of those frog skins over time, as well as engineer economic crises, control an inbuilt boom-bust cycle, and punch you repeatedly in the groin. The Federal Reserve, a decidedly unfederal private cartel of bloodline bankers, hatched in secret within the smoky confines of a clubhouse for good old boys on Jekyll Island off the Georgia coast in 1910, and which has directly caused the depreciation of the dollar by 95% and rising since its foul and cursed conception. But remember, kids, this is the best possible system for preserving stored value over time, and if you disagree, well, just keep piping off about it, and you'll find yourself disappeared in a van or jumping off a tall building, you pinko Bolshevik swine. The Federal Reserve. We reserve the right to rig the economy against you. The Federal Reserve. We reserve the right to fuck you. The Federal Reserve. We reserve the right to kick you in the face. Federal Reserve, it's the best we can do it. If you doubt it, you're a Bolshevik swine. Oh.
But I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
Miss Lewinsky, I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never.
These allegations are false, and I need to go back to work for the American people. Thank you.
Hello, I'm New York Governor Kathy Hockaloogie. My last name's actually phonetic. It's like this. I'm New York Governor Kathy, and I'm here to say I'm gonna take your guns away, and I'm gonna jam syringes in your arms, you little shits. And also, black kids don't know what computers are. So fuck you and do what I say, or I'm gonna sick my legalized terror squads on your ass. I say bring back stop and frisk. Bring it back, baby. We need to nerf the entire world and eliminate risk, especially for me and my finances. As the great Margaret Thatcher said, there's no such thing as community, only people and their families. And I got mine, Jack, and I'm gonna keep it that way, you unwashed, stinking, filthy pores. Governor Kathy. Ow. I'm gonna wring my hands together, too. I'm gonna look as evil as fucking possible when I say this. I'm the least likable person on Earth. And I'm gonna take your fucking guns, you morons.
Right now we have, young black kids growing up in the Bronx who don't even know what the word computer is. They don't know. They don't know these things.
Brought to you by Pfizer. CBS Health Watch sponsored by Pfizer. Anderson Cooper 360. Brought to you by Pfizer.
ABC News Nightline. Brought to you by Pfizer. Making a difference. Brought to you by Pfizer.
CNN Tonight. Brought to you by Pfizer. Early Start. Brought to you by Pfizer. Friday night on Aaron Burnett Out Front. Brought to you by Pfizer. This Week with George Stephanopoulos is brought to you by Pfizer.
This weather report brought to you by Pfizer.
Today's countdown to the royal wedding is brought to you by Pfizer.
And now a CBS Sports Update brought to you by Pfizer.
Meet the Press Data Download. Brought to you by Pfizer.
This portion of CBS This Morning sponsored by Pfizer.
On how to find the hidden sugars in the American family diet. Sponsored by Pfizer.
Estás escuchando Barbarian Nordics.
Alright, what is up, love doves, and welcome to a Sunday night Little Raven rant. We are gathered here today to vent about why and how and the reasons that I feel, and many others also, not just me, this is a very common sentiment in the modern American political landscape, why so many of us feel completely homeless in the quote freest country on earth, and completely trapped and discouraged by what is a nakedly authoritarian duopoly, a monopoly of two parties working together behind the scenes to keep third parties off ballots and to maintain their stranglehold on power. And when there's only two parties to choose from, then it's very easy to just pay off both parties. And that's exactly what the big players do. I think an underappreciated lobby group, there's a lot of talk about this lobby group and that lobby group. Big Pharma. I think Big Pharma is one of the most, just has its filthy paws just completely encircling the nuts of both parties, and they get whatever the fuck they want. When you only have two choices, you can just pay off both parties. Boom. And then you don't even have to sweat the election because you're good either way. Maybe you give one party a little more than the other, you know what I'm saying? You scratch a little bit harder on one back, but at the end of the day, from what I hear, politicians are incredibly cheap. You got a couple $100,000, you can pretty much buy a politician. You can get some boutique legislation. And this is the sad state of affairs in the late stage capitalist imperial decline era of the US. So this first quote is not mine, but the second quote is an original. So someone sent me this fantastic meme. It says, "A liberal is someone who opposes every war except the current one and supports all civil rights movements except the one that's going on right now." Beautifully spoken. I don't even feel I have to extrapolate on that. It says it all. A liberal is someone who opposes every war except the current war and supports all civil rights movements except the one that's going on right now. A conservative, now this is a Little Raven original. A conservative is someone who opposes a small number of wars when the Democrats hold office, and increasingly someone who just reflexively blames either immigrants or George Soros for all of the world's problems. So obviously I'm pretty much disgusted at both sides of the electoral political spectrum, and I'm very disappointed in whatever the fuck it is, whatever you would call the US left nowadays. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. But I just want to make it very clear that this is not this is outside of the electoral political landscape, which in my opinion is completely fucked. I'm talking about movement building. So I'm not trying to suck off Republicans or suggest that, I'm just going to vote red or whatever. It's just that I'm feel increasingly homeless in that my principles and the things that I believe in just don't seem valued by the professional left, the professional movement building left. So what are some supposed core values of the left, and how have they been so nakedly compromised, especially in the last 5 years? Number one, I always felt that it was what people on the left always talk about doing is speaking truth to power, That's supposed to be a core value, that there's supposed to be some sort of understanding that power corrupts and that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And in a late stage capitalist landscape, the power is so concentrated. As Vladimir Lenin said, imperialism is actually the final stage of capitalism. So we're in the late stage imperialist kind of desperate situation, and there should be an understanding that the people who are making legislation are not our friends. They're going to have to be forced to make concessions. They're not going to make concessions in and of themselves. And when you say speaking truth to power, it includes all power. So anywhere there's power concentrated at the top, you have to look at the decisions being made by these people skeptically. And here's where we get into the power of the behavior managers and the psychologists and child psychologists and adult psychologists that are working with quantum computers and AI to develop new and better ways to manage your behavior. They had known prior to 2020, they had run focus groups and discovered that people had an incredible amount of trust in the healthcare system. People just have this inherent trust of doctors, nurses. And so when there was a situation where there was directives coming from a corrupt top of the pyramid, so I'm talking about the CDC, I'm talking about Tony Fauci and his minions, there was this reflexive kind of drive just to like trust these people, that these people have our best they have our best interests at heart. And like, I want to believe that too. But when it became clear that that wasn't the case, when it became clear that Tony Fauci lied and lied and lied on almost every aspect of the thing, there was just this unwillingness to face that truth and an unwillingness to delve into like the ramifications of that. Like how he said at the beginning that people didn't have to wear masks, and then later was wearing 2 masks and making crazy contradictions all around. Meanwhile, there was like all this research compiling that showed that masks didn't make any difference at all. And yet, if you were to question that during this time frame, rather than have like a discourse with people who are supposed to speak truth to power, who are supposed to be skeptical of power, rather than having a discourse where you can like share information and talk, my experience was I just got screamed at, ghosted, judged, and like I became completely radioactive within the group of the body politic that I had thought that I had fit into. And it was like a real wake-up call, because it's like, because the way that it fucking shook out, you had like conservative media was kind of taking the lead on reporting this like real ass shit information about the lack of oh man, that was hard for me to say. Lack of efficacy of masks, the jib jabs not preventing transmission, the very real side effects from the jib jab, which I saw in people very close to me who got very sick after taking the jib jab, and evidence that the jib jab has other side effects that are not being acknowledged. This is all stuff that like we should all care about as a body politic together. And I understand if you see it another way, in which you see it that by me questioning the jib jab, I'm being a selfish asshole and killing grandma. But I think that the jib jab is actually not good for grandma either. And it's now been like come around. It's come all the way around that that natural immunity was very effective, that you did not need to get jib jabbed if you had the natural immunity. And states that had very loose regulations versus states that became biomedical dictatorships had pretty much the same outcome. And you might be saying like, no, that's not true, but it is true. You just have to actually look at the raw data, which is boring, but you have to actually sift through the raw data and see it for yourself. If you just read the front page or any page of the New York Crimes, you're going to be left with this false reality. And so this is another aspect of why it's so difficult to kind of find a political home in this country is down here. So I did make some notes today. So I wanted to talk about like what are some parts of like what's left of the American left that I actually still want to be a part of, or what would be some pillars of movement building that I feel would be incredibly like useful for actually building like a mass awareness. And like when you have enough numbers, you can actually force change. So people do have the power. It's political education. Political education is the bottleneck that is holding everything up. And along with political education, it goes side by side, is media savvy, media awareness. understanding of the propagandistic nature of media. It fascinates me that people on the left worship Noam Chomsky, and Noam Chomsky wrote this big long book called Manufacturing Consent back in the fucking 80s. And it wasn't just him, by the way. There was, in fact, I'm gonna pause real quick because this other author never gets credit because Noam Chomsky has a huge ego. And he said some really fucked up things during the COVID situation too. So let me just look up there's 2 authors of Manufacturing Consent, and Noam ever gives credit to the other one. So I'm gonna make sure I do. Because you got a big ego, Noam. I remember when Noam was like, well, that's actually their problem then. If someone was pointing out that by his plan, the Chomsky plan for the unvaccinated people was just to let them rot in their homes. And the interviewer was like, well, don't these people need to be able to go out and get groceries? And he's like, well, that's actually their problem then. Let them starve. It's like, wow, Noam, how internationalist of you. Edward S. Herman. Edward S. Herman was the other author who probably wrote most of it. I'm just guessing. This is parody. Don't sue me, Noam. But I have a feeling that Edward S. Herman did most of the writing. The Manufacturing Consent, the Political Economy of the Mass Media. Absolutely critical reading for everybody. It is long, it's a bit dense, but even just reading the cliff notes of it, they point out, Herman and Chomsky point out, like in exquisite detail, just how much reading a newspaper uncritically or watching a mainstream news program uncritically is just brainwashing and propagandizing. You are being hypnotized. You're being hypnotized, and there's deep-seated memes of thought and ideas that get implanted into your subconscious, and then you just end up regurgitating them unconsciously, because that's the power of the subconscious. The behavior managers know very well the power of the subconscious, and they've derived all these new, very clever, innovative ways of digging the shit into the advertisers too. The marketers have been working on this also. Like when you just sit there and you're spaced out and watching an advertisement, you are absorbing information on a subconscious level, and that is a major bottleneck holding up a mass movement in this country, and also frustrating me when it comes to my place in this empire, which I'm just more and more, I feel like I just don't have a place in the empire, and I'm looking to get out of Dodge. But okay, so other supposed core values of the left. Worker solidarity, that's a basic one. Worker solidarity, that you stand up for your fellow workers and that you support strong unions and any possible way for workers to gain leverage over their employers. That's a positive thing so that they don't get exploited. And I thought this was something that we shared across the left, and people on the left love, like, you know, sometimes they'll do entire podcast series about like Karl Marx and Marxism, which is about the workers seizing the means of production and shifting the balance of power between bosses and workers. But then again, this brilliantly concocted plan, when they knew that people had so much fucking faith in the healthcare sector that they just figured out, like, this hack of the American psyche. If it's a health decree, you have to fucking follow suit or kick them to the curb, as Chomsky said. That's actually their problem. And worker solidarity, sorry, I keep bumping my mic here as I'm making my gesticulations, being a little fired up. Worker solidarity in the era of the I don't know what to call it, because I just want to call it the pandemic, but I know that's going to trigger some people. The COVID event, the COVID shit show. There was like, people on the left are running around with syringes, just jamming them into nurses' shoulders, and then the nurse is like, but I don't think I want to take it. I already got the thing, and I got better from it, and I have natural immunity. Kick them to the curb. They lose their job. And we just had like thousands of healthcare workers who were just cool with their natural immunity, and who were under the impression, as I was, in 2019, I thought that our health matters were personal matters. That's a personal choice. And you kind of keep it to yourself, and you respect people's privacy about health matters. Nope, that all got thrown out the window. If you don't take the experimental medical procedure, you're killing grandma. And if you're a nurse who's just trying to help people and you don't take it, F you, you lose your job. Thousands of healthcare workers lost their jobs. And the left was like cheering this on. The left had no problem with it at all. I'm talking about like the institutional left and the liberal left, the New York Crimes subscriber class left, as well as the professional left, as well as like the fucking government psyop, Democratic Socialists of America, which is just like a wing of the Democratic Party. They were all celebrating this. And that was just like drop dead shocking to me. And what it did is, if you're actually serious about building a mass movement of left-wing thought in the country, man, did you fuck up. Because what happened was all these people that got fired, people that were kind of like put off by the whole thing, that didn't like people running around jamming syringes into their thighs, many of them went running into the waiting hands of the right, because the right, for whatever reason, were actually more just real about this and actually presenting like the real data and trying to get to the bottom of things. The left was so like, no, like plug their ears like, nah, I can't hear you. And it just drove hordes of people to the right. And unfortunately, when you have a situation where an empire is in decline, it's basically either socialism or barbarism. And I'm not trying to shit talk barbarians over here. We all know that. It's a turn of phrase that I'm utilizing. What happens if the U.S. is already so primed to like villainize the left and villainize any sort of redistributive economic policies, that what happens is the right wing just gains all that strength, the aggregor of the right, which again, I find that disgusting too, because they just want to blame immigrants for everything, or just blame everything on fucking that every social movement is George Soros. Like, okay, let's not just completely throw out the very real problem of police brutality in the country, and like how people of color and poor white people are just, it's an issue. And I'll say this, like, I'm not like an anti-cop. I know that if you go back in the archives, some of my episodes are very critical of the police, and especially the origins of the police. But the police in Phoenix have always been very respectful to me. And they've helped some loved ones of mine as well, and shown like a lot of care when like there's been tragedies in the family and stuff like that. The local Phoenix police, I will say, especially the police of color that I've engaged with, have just shown a lot of compassion and empathy, and they've just been very professional. So, but with that said, like, their police brutality is an issue all across the board, and in certain areas of the country, it's like much worse. And that's what, there was a huge movement to raise awareness about police brutality against people of color, but then everyone on the right was just like saying that this was hatched by George Soros, and that we're just being used by the ruling class to sow division in the country. And it was like, okay, well, I get that the ruling class is trying to sow division in the country, and they are trying to destabilize us. But at the same time, like, can we talk about police brutality or not? You know, like, it's so tempting to just like boil things down to black and white, like super uber simple. And things are just very nuanced. Everything in life is very nuanced. So some other supposed core tenets of the left. I thought we were supposed to be anti-war. I thought we were supposed to be interested in world peace. But you have people, especially liberals, the New York Crimes subscriber class, will just like, when you try to talk to them about geopolitics or whatever, they'll be like, yeah, but I mean, Putin needs to be stopped though. I mean, he needs to be stopped. You'll try to talk to them about how the entire nation of Ukraine was sacrificed by these very sick fucks to basically shape Ukraine into a sharp object to poke the Russian bear with. And as it was clear from the get-go, just on a numbers game, as hard of fighters as the Ukrainians are, and they are incredibly hard fighters, it's just a numbers game. And you have like a massive superpower right next door that if you're in like a one-on-one war against, it's just not going to go well, just because of like resources and numbers and population. Also, typically in history, when you pick a fight with Russia, they end up in your capital. Happened in Berlin, happened in Paris. It just seems to be when you go out of your way to pick a fight with Russia, it's not great. It's not a great move. And so I'm still trying to talk to people about this. Like, why, when you wave a Ukrainian flag and you're in support of the U.S. current policy towards Ukraine, you're actually waving the flag of like the death of the nation, because it's just an absolute horror show. And this idea that the current Ukraine is some bastion of democracy is just a joke. Zelensky has banned all the opposition parties, and he's like forced conscription now. And it's like, it's an absolute shit show. But a liberal will be like, yeah, but I mean, Putin has to be stopped. And it's like, from what exactly? What does Putin have to be stopped from? The Russian Federation, first off, it's not just Putin, it's a whole federal assembly in Russia. It's a whole thing called the Duma, the State Duma, that Putin is the head of, but he's certainly not like this mad dictator. These policies are being generated from the Russian Federation, the leadership of the Russian Federation, and they were seeking diplomacy at every turn. They did not want to go into Ukraine, but the ethnic Russians were being attacked. The ethnic Russians in the Donbass were being shelled and killed, and the ethnic Russians in the Donbass were asking for help, like, please help us. We have these ultra-nationalists, neo-Nazi adjacent folks shelling us and killing our civilians. Can you help us? And finally, Putin, as a political actor, was under enough political pressure from his own people to intervene on behalf of these ethnic Russians that he intervened. But before that, he was trying every which way to come to a diplomatic solution. And he's been very clear for decades that he doesn't want NATO expanding to his borders, because he understands he tried to join NATO. Remember, Putin tried to join NATO when Bill Clinton was president, and Clinton said he'd have to ask his people. So Putin was like, hey, can we just join NATO and be a part of the whole thing, and then we don't have to have another fucking Cold War or, God forbid, hot war? And Bill Clinton's like, even though I'm the most powerful man in the world, I have to go talk with my people. And then he came back and he was like, yeah, my people say no, you can't join NATO. Because empires need enemies, and the Russian Federation is the perfect enemy. And we can't not have an enemy, because that would affect the bottom line for the military-industrial complex, which is the only sector of the economy that's actually still doing well, because we are a war state in a permanent state of war. Some overt wars that you know about, and a whole bunch of dirty ones that you don't. So Putin, even after he went in to intervene on behalf of the ethnic Russians, he still tried to come to a deal. And Zelensky was ready to make a deal to prevent like this wholesale sacrifice of the nation of Ukraine. And NATO, they sent their lackey Boris Johnson to say, no, you cannot sign this deal. You have to keep fighting. So it's basically like someone's just like tied down to a table and just being eviscerated. And someone comes in and is like, wait, we can stop this. If we just make a few concessions here, we can stop the torture. Nope, you have to continue. You have to continue the fight. And now it's to the point where there's no more men. There's not enough men to fight anymore. And they're sending people with special needs, and they're sending women, and they're forced conscription, and they have other NATO countries are sending Ukrainian back from other NATO countries to go to the front line. And it's just, again, the Russians, the saying about them is slow to saddle, quick to ride. And they've now are like, fine, if there's not going to be a diplomatic solution, we will end this militarily. And it's just a real tough situation for the Ukrainians. So I do care about the people of Ukraine, and I do support the sovereignty of Ukraine. I don't support their current state because it's very authoritarian and they've sacrificed their own people, and I find that fucked up. But like, I'm not trying to hate on anyone here. I just could see, and I've been talking about this for years, you could see the writing on the wall. And because the U.S. is just so dedicated to causing problems for Russia, destabilizing the Russian people, that they're just not allowing Ukraine to do anything but continue sacrifice itself. And you have liberals are just totally fine with this because they just believe what they read in the New York Times. Another broken core tenet of the institutional left that's turned me off is the hypocrisy around bodily autonomy. I was always led to believe that lefties thought my body, my choice, but when it comes to actual science versus experimental medical procedures when it comes to mountains of stats that showed no appreciable difference between states with harsh lockdowns and mandates and states without, when there's no reckoning with the societal and interpersonal costs of lockdowns. And I'm not just talking economically, although that was devastating. 1 in 5 businesses owned by people of color went down due to the shit show around the lockdowns. So like the liberty costs of the mandates, and then the interpersonal costs for people who are struggling with domestic abuse, depression, all kind of stuff. When you're stuck in your house and your house is not safe, then things become a real nightmare. This was never reckoned with. And as I mentioned before, like the naked corruption at the top with fucking Collins and Fauci and the rest. Just because people on the right were pointing that out, people on the left were like, made the sign of the cross and was like, refused to even engage with the data, the information. Science TM versus actual science. And as we all know, math doesn't lie, but stats do. And when there's power concentrated so tightly, you can buy studies to prove, quote unquote, prove whatever it is you're trying to prove. So my opinion about the jib jab was that it was a eugenics program against our elders to save money on pensions and Social Security. And another aspect of the whole thing, which has never been reckoned with, is the astronomical increase in death rate. You can look to insurance companies, look at their stats, and you can see that the death rate, especially among elders, completely skyrocketed right after the jib jabs. So this is my perception that the jib jabs were just as harmful, if not more so, than the thing in and of itself. The product of the pangolin fucking the bat, as we were told. Not the obvious, made in a lab, gain of function, in my opinion, eugenics instrument. So that hypocrisy drives me insane. Another thing that pisses me off about the institutional left, and I'll throw in the institutional right on this one as well, is the intentional misunderstanding and demonization of Karl Marx, a man from the 1800s with a big beard who ends the Communist Manifesto with, "Workers have nothing to lose but their chains. We have a world to win." It's about empowering workers to gain leverage over their employers so that they're not completely exploited. And Karl Marx did a scientific critique of the system of capitalism, and all of his predictions have come true. The most glaring is that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. That was a book written by Lenin, but Marx also predicted that the highest stage of capitalism would be imperialism, as capitalist countries need to find fresh, new workforces to exploit in order to maintain their rate of profit. Karl Marx demonstrated that the rate of profit tends to fall over time, which means that exploitation has to increase to keep the profits up. And it's incredibly frustrating as an American because I feel like it's just impossible to have a nuanced and balanced conversation about these ideas without people screaming at you about Stalin and Mao. And then if you try to talk to them about the fact that, like, have you read any books that non-actually balanced books about Stalin, because half the shit we're told about him is completely false. But putting that aside, like, there's just very little room for discussing these ideas, and I think that our society could benefit massively from a democratization of the economy in the form of worker-owned businesses, more collectively owned businesses, which is a fantastic business model, which has a great record of success. So it's not just all about unions, which the top of the union pyramid is completely bought and compromised. It's referred to as the AFL-CIO, especially for the shit that it's pulled in Latin America, helping to exploit workers there. And so again, it's not just about trusting Joe Biden when he's saying, like, "I'm the most pro-union president ever, Mac. Here, give me I never saw a union I didn't like, man." it's not, first off, that's bullshit because he broke the railroad strike and completely fucked over workers. I mean, Joe Biden is a literal demon. He's a horrible man. He's been horrible his whole career, and he'll always be horrible. And at this point, I'm not even sure it's the same Joe Biden, because if you look at the Biden from the 80s versus this walking corpse, skull-faced psychopath that sniffs kids, it doesn't even look like the same guy anymore. So I think he has been completely possessed, and we literally have a demon zombie president. But Orange Man bad, I guess, so we have to vote for him. That also pisses me off about the left, that there's very little room to talk about election rigging and election fuckery, because then you're immediately called, by the New York Times subscriber class, you're immediately called a election denialist, and then that's like the end of the conversation. There's all these buzzwords that people that get hypnotized by the New York Times, there's these buzzwords that they throw out to just like end a conversation, and election denialism is one of those. So you can't talk about the voting machines, you can't talk about the irregularities. I did an episode with my friend who worked at a polling station in Maricopa County, and he saw it with his own eyes, and this is a veteran who friggin' fought in Kandahar. Like, he's a trustworthy person. If he says something, it's true. He was just trying to make some extra money, figured this was a decent opportunity, and he was like appalled and shocked at what he saw with the casual disregard for the custody of the ballots left lying around, ballots left uncounted, complete dysfunctionality of the voting stations, machines not working, printers not working, ballots being the wrong size. I mean, you can go back and listen to the archives. Stephen the infantryman talks about his experience working at a polling station. So again, but you can't have a nuanced conversation about this, because then you're automatically an election denialist, and it's frustrating. Another annoying thing about the left that I really think folks could benefit from increasing their understanding and opening their mind a little bit. You need to have an open mind in life. Like, whether you identify as someone on the left or someone on the right, you need to have an open mind, because otherwise you just become like this programmable zombie that just immediately disregards anything if it's coming from the other side. And you don't look for things that can bring us together, because that's what the ruling classes really wants to avoid. They want to avoid the left and the right coming together. They want to avoid us overcoming these culture war differences and things that we fight to tooth and nail over, and seeing that the ruling class is the root of the problem. That's what they're terrified of. And that's why they're constantly introducing all these boutique topics to divide us and keep us bickering amongst ourselves. So the left has a blind spot, and it's the Bitcoin blind spot. There's this rather absurd, in my opinion, argument that you can't support Bitcoin because of the carbon it takes to mine Bitcoin, which it's like, yeah, I get it. It takes a lot of electricity, but the possible positive aspects of a decentralized currency is so much more valuable, and would be such like a potential. It has the potential to completely transform our economic system, which would reduce the ability to completely exploit entire nation states with mechanisms like the IMF and the World Bank. Having a decentralized currency is literally priceless. Bitcoin is a brilliant program, and obviously, investing in cryptocurrency is risky. It is inherently risky. It is an incredibly volatile situation. But if you look at the long-term trajectory of Bitcoin, just look at the long-term graph and tell me that wasn't a good investment for those people that bought it back when it was, even when it was like $1,000 or $2,000 a coin, which I remember those days when I first started fucking around with crypto. Bitcoin was like $1,600 a coin, and I was like, oh, that's so expensive. Wow, what a dummy I was. It's now $65,000, and it was all the way up to $72,000 a coin a bit ago. But it is incredibly volatile, and it is very easy to lose money. And I myself have I've made a little money and I've lost a little money. So I'm certainly, this is not financial advice, and I'm not romanticizing it, but I think that to have a total blind spot around cryptocurrency and just like cede the entire territory to crypto bros and tech bros, and not recognize that it is an opportunity for small time investors and little guys and workers to actually store their value in a way that can keep up with inflation. Inflation is a hidden tax, and the Federal Reserve is a rigged cartel. And the boom and bust cycle is built into everything. And if you just put your dollars under your bed and save them, they're going to lose value over time. They're going to lose purchasing power over time. We want to avoid that. Bitcoin is, if you're willing to look into it, and I recently started an audiobook about Bitcoin so I can understand it better, it is a very real potential. It has very positive possibilities, and it can be used as a store of value so that your hard-earned money that you work for, that you trade your priceless currency of your time for money in the form of your labor, then that value can maintain over time and not be whittled away by the hidden tax known as inflation. Now, the next core tenet of the left that has been expertly splintered to weaken the coherence of any kind of movement is the environment. And I'd like to take some moments here to try to have a nuanced discussion about this topic. One of my formative experiences as a child was seeing my first documentary about the deforestation of the rainforest. It was a completely shattering experience because the first half of the documentary was just showing how beautiful and amazing this rainforest is with all these magical creatures, this amazing foliage, colors, the rain dripping off the leaves. I'm like completely enraptured. And then the second half of the documentary is like, yeah, but because of humans, this is all fucking coming down. And the extrapolations back when I was like a young tyke, as a Reagan baby, they were extrapolating all these things like, oh, there's going to be no rainforest left by 2020. Like, I remember hearing that, all this type of shit. And so it just leaves you with like this alarmist and tragic kind of feeling of like, wow, I have so much appreciation for this beauty, but then there's nothing I can do to try to preserve it. And the reality is a lot more complicated than that. And the environmental question has been simplified and targeted to go in a certain direction. And that's what I want to bring attention to right now. But I'm not saying that I don't deeply care about the environment and that I'm not deeply concerned about things like pollution in the air, pollution in the seas, corporate pollution, military pollution, thermonuclear pollution, all that type of stuff. The fucking with the ionosphere, I think, is very problematic. But what ends up being hyper-focused on is, instead of holding large corporations and militaries to account for polluting the environment, it's instead incumbent on the little people, the workers and the little people, to make sacrifices in their lives so that they can make some small, imperceptible improvement in this situation, which is being propagated by these massive movers and shakers. And so that's where things like the obsession with carbon comes in. And there's an inherent hypocrisy to the obsession with carbon because of how the carbon is counted. All of the geothermal vents under the ocean are releasing shit tons of carbon all the time, and that doesn't even get counted in the calculations. And while we're expected to have like carbon credit scores or whatever the fuck, and use paper bags instead of plastic bags, which by the way causes more deforestation anyways, there's like no accountability for these other big factors. Then you also have these billionaires and like hedge fund managers and some of the most greedy, like amoral people on the planet. They're getting in on the party, and they're working these scams with carbon tax swaps and shit like that, carbon swaps, carbon write-offs, carbon this, carbon that. There's also an effort to tokenize the natural environment in the form of natural asset corporations, which they're talking about trading on Wall Street, and it would be like there's a lake in Uruguay, but it's a corporation, and these psychopaths now own the lake, and you can trade on the futures of the lake and stuff like that. Dude, that shit is just so dystopian, and it's a way to create like another array of betting, another array of financialization. I know I'm not using the right terminology because I'm not a finances guy, because I'm not a dork. Kidding. I think it is good to have financial literacy, and I am working on that in my own way. But I do find it all very tedious. But yeah, I don't think that we should be tokenizing the natural environment. I don't think we should be privatizing the natural resources of other countries and putting them in the hands of private multinational psychos and hedge funds and having like this thing that is inherent to our experience here. Like it is our right to have access to our natural resources as humans. That's true across the board. And there's so many people that are dependent on all of these natural resources and natural, quote, assets like lakes and rivers and stuff, that there has to be some sort of like understanding that these are shared assets among all of us. And cannot be monopolized. So the other aspect of the environmental discussion that never gets discussed is the very real role of geoengineering. And this drives me nuts because there's a certain contingent of folks, especially on the left, that the moment you try to talk about geoengineering, they call you alt-right adjacent and a conspiracy theorist, and it's like the conversation ends. But geoengineering is not a conspiracy theory. Geoengineering is like a well-documented fact, and it's happening in massive ways, especially around cloud seeding all over the world and trying to create rain when there's no rain and trying to prevent rain. They're even talking about like privatizing climates, like creating machines that can create little perfect microclimates for private events and stuff like that. And we have no idea the consequences of this, and I can guarantee it's not good because nature likes to flow. Nature does not like to be forced. And anytime you're imposing your will like that so drastically on something as sensitive and mysterious as the atmosphere, in my humble opinion, no good things can come from it. So yes, I want to save the environment, but no, I do not trust a bunch of amoral, soulless, Moloch worshipping billionaires to have the answer for how we go about protecting the environment. Like almost everything else, it requires a raising of our consciousness as a collective so we can see these as shared features of our experience and our inherent right of all of us, and that we're all responsible for protecting the well-being of. So another core tenet of what I thought it was, what liberals claim to be about, is this idea of internationalism, of actually giving a fuck about other countries. And yet what I've seen in my life is that vote blue no matter who people do not give a single solitary fuck about foreign policy, because if they did, they would completely abandon the vote blue no matter who ridiculous slogan because of the horror that always happens under democratic administrations. This trick that I'm starting to notice is that what happens is the thing that you don't expect to happen for whatever party is in power, the blue team or the red team, that's the shit that gets pushed because people aren't paying as much attention about it. Like, the people forget that the COVID 1984 authoritarianism happened under Donald Trump, supposedly the liberty guy, all about freedom and liberties. And we saw a crackdown on our freedom and liberties like we've never seen before, at least in my lifetime. Friggin' curfews, mandates, this, that, lockdowns, can't leave your house, forced medical procedures, experimental ones at that. And that all happened under supposedly the freedom and liberty guy, Donald Trump. Under democratic administrations, we always have the most horrific warmongering psychopathy. Under Obama was the president in charge when NATO and the US empire completely destroyed the most prosperous nation state in Africa, known as Libya, at least definitely in North Africa, known as Libya. Libya was like the linchpin for the whole region. Libya was interested in creating a Pan-African union, and interested in creating a Pan-African currency backed by gold to free themselves of the exploitative, horrific terms of IMF, World Bank servitude. And NATO and the US empire just completely destroyed this proud African state under Barack Obama's watch, and reduced it to a place where there's open air slave markets, and they're still battling it out for who's gonna seize the power vacuum left by the really horrible public assassination, grisly, gruesome, I won't describe, public assassination of Muammar Gaddafi. And so I just think that there's I see all this tension between quote-unquote liberals and then people who define themselves as anti-imperialist leftists versus like other forms of institutional leftists, like the Democratic Socialists of America, which is just a wing of the Democratic Party. But there's like all this like conflict and like smearing of anti-imperialist leftists that were actually like alt-right adjacent and all this kind of stuff. But I think having an anti-imperialist framework is absolutely essential when you're in the belly of the beast, when you occupy the imperial core, and it's something we should all come together around. Honestly, on the right and the left, we can all be anti-imperialist, because if you're an America First person, that means that you should be anti-imperialist. You should be in favor of American wealth being used for the benefit of the American people, and not to sow chaos and destabilization around the world for the benefit of incredibly infinitesimally small number of billionaire psychopaths that get together in tunnels in Italy and worship Moloch together. So I'd rather not let those guys run the show. I don't see how you can call yourself a leftist when you cozy up to the state in the name of things like forced medical procedures and mandating experimental injections, when you romanticize the three-letter agencies because of Trump derangement syndrome, and you buy the propaganda and the bullshit coming from MSNBC that the three-letter agencies are like this bulwark against Trump. No, they're not. They have their own agenda, and it happens in the shadows, and it's not your friend. When you cozy up to the state in this regard, you are betraying your sisters and brothers and workers across the global South. And that's why we have to support liberation struggles against colonialism everywhere. And obviously including at home, as Native Americans and immigrant communities are still oppressed and displaced all the time in our society. Also, we need to stop with the celebrity worship masquerading as politics thing. Just because you might like someone's personality, that shouldn't be like the cause celeb for you to defend that person no matter what. And we have these like celebrity politicians who make up the squad, supposedly the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, but they never meet a war that they don't love. They never meet a war funding bill that they don't vote for. They are actually not anti-war at all. You actually have members of the Freedom Caucus on the Republican side that are way more anti-war than the so-called progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And that's because the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are both war parties, because it is a war state. The U.S. empire is a war empire. War is what we trade in. War is how we profit. The U.S. empire runs on the blood of other nations. It's a hard fact, but it's a fact. And the sooner we all come to terms with that, the sooner, again, we can come together to identify the real cause, the real root cause of the problems, which is late-stage capitalism and the out-of-control psychopathy of the ruling class. So what are some pillars of movement building that I think are really important and things that could possibly connect people across the spectrum, across the political spectrum? I think we can all agree upon worker solidarity. I think we can all agree on the importance of political education and media savvy. And that's going to mean different things. If you're a libertarian, you're going to want that political education to be a libertarian education. If you're a hardcore socialist, you're going to want the political education to have a socialist leaning. But if we can have an open discourse, a free market of ideas, and talk to one another about things, you might be surprised. There might be a lot that the libertarians and the socialists actually agree on. And honestly, standing up for workers and workers' rights is something that could be that. That is not a non-libertarian idea. Liberty should apply to all people, including workers, and workers should not be just completely exploited and taken advantage of. And again, things like collectively owned businesses, I think, have a lot of potential, and they could work within a free market so that people don't freak out that we're becoming like a, it's hard to believe that there'd be the word socialism and the word communism has been dragged through the mud so extensively. It's hard to believe that any type of movement could really build in this country using those words. But if you focus on collectively owned businesses that still operate within like a free market economy situation, and there's just choice in the matter, I think the libertarians could get behind that, because they can get behind the freedom to choose. Like the libertarians always say that if you want to create a commune on private land and have a commune, they have no problem with that. They just don't want communes and collective farms to be imposed on everybody. And I honestly understand where they're coming from there. I think respect for individuality is another really important pillar. So there's respect for individuality while having a cognizance of the power of collective action. So cognizance of the power of collective action while still respecting the individual and individuality. And I just think if you're serious about building a movement in the U.S., you've got to have a lot of respect for the individuality and people's choices, because that's just the nature of, sure, it's because of the brainwashing and the propaganda, and anti-communism is the unofficial religion of the United States. Sure, it is because of that. It's because of the empire education conversation, but at the same time, you got to work with what you got, right? You can't just pretend like you have blue clay when you have gray clay. You got to work with the gray clay, and the American body politic clay is just completely obsessed with individual sovereignty. So you got to work with that, in my opinion, if you're trying to build a movement. And that goes in with protecting civil liberties. And then finally, this idea of inclusivity. So what does that really mean? Political inclusivity is the thing that's needed. And that is a willingness to parse disagreements and have uncomfortable and even, quote, unsafe, unquote, conversations. Because conversations sometimes have to be uncomfortable. Some people might even say that they feel unsafe in certain conversations, but that doesn't mean that you cannot have the conversations. The foundational importance of having inclusivity within your movement is more important than the emotional 100% permanent emotional safety for all the participants, because that's just unrealistic, and that's going to be used as a wedge to delegitimize movements and to drive people apart. All right, everybody. Well, we've crafted, we've rafted, we've snacked, we've packed, we've lacked, we've sacked, we've ripped, and we've stripped. And we have arrived at the end of this episode of the Barbarian Noetics podcast. Thank you so much for joining, for sharing some headspace with me, and thank you for supporting the podcast week in, week out, helping me dodge these algorithmic gremlins, helping me stay on the air. And I am listener supported, so I really can use your support. The support links are in the description. I won't go through all the rigmarole, but the best way to help me is the direct donate on PayPal or Cash App. But I also have a new way that y'all can help me too, for anyone out there who's dabbling in the crypto space. I know I didn't think I would hear myself say those words either, but my best friend has turned me around on opening my mind, and I ranted a little bit about this already, how there's like a Bitcoin blind spot on the left. And I think that decentralized currency is incredibly powerful. And you can tip me with Solana now. So Solana is a blockchain. It is its own blockchain, and it has some certain features which make it really good for like quick, small transactions, very small fees, very quick to move around. So you can tip me with Solana now, and I would be greatly appreciated. I would greatly appreciate it, I should say. I know grammar. So you can tip me with Solana. The address is going to be in the description. And if you're not familiar with Solana, I recommend that you all familiarize yourself. I think we all need to open our minds, different ways of preserving our wealth for storing value across time. And I do think that even though it's volatile, there's a lot of potential positive uses and functions of blockchains like Solana. So you can tip me with that now. I would be greatly appreciative. And I'm tripping over my words because it's getting late, so we're going to bring this episode to a close. I'll be back on the air really soon. Thanks again, as always, for joining, and much love, everybody. All right, peace.
In every American community, you have varying shades of political opinion. One of the shadiest of these is the liberals. An outspoken group on many subjects. 10 degrees to the left of center in good times, 10 degrees to the right of center if it affects them personally. So here then is a lesson in safe logic. I cried when they shot Medgar Evers, tears ran down my spine, and I cried when they shot Mr. Kennedy, as though I'd lost a father of mine. But Malcolm X got what was coming. He got what he asked for this time. So love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal. Get it? I go to civil rights rallies and I put down the old DAR. DAR, that's the dykes of the American Revolution. I love Harry and Sidney and Sammy. I hope every colored boy becomes a star. But don't talk about revolution. That's going a little bit too far. So love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal. I cheered when Humphrey was chosen, my faith in the system restored. And I'm glad that the commies were thrown out from the AFL-CIO board. And I love Puerto Ricans and Negroes, as long as they don't move next door. So love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal. Ah, the people of old Mississippi should all hang their heads in shame. Now I can't understand how their minds work. What's the matter, don't they watch Les Crane? But if you ask me to bus my children, I hope the cops take down your name. So love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal. Yes, I read New Republic and Nation. I've learned to take every view. You know, I've memorized Lerner and Golden. I feel like I'm almost a Jew. But when it comes to times like Korea, there's no one more red, white, and blue. So love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal. I vote for the Democratic Party. They want the UN to be strong. I attend all the Pete Seeger concerts. He sure gets me singing those songs. And I'll send all the money you ask for, but don't ask me to come on along. So love me, love me, love me, I'm a liberal. Sure, once I was young and impulsive, I wore every conceivable pin. Even went to socialist meetings, learned all the old Union hymns.